You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade.
On this episode of From Embers, myself and another anarchist person of color talk about racism, identity politics, and various projects that she's involved with in Montreal. Enjoy. Today, I'm here with Rosa, who's a good friend of mine and someone who's been an anarchist and organizing around race and racism, among other things, for a while now. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi. I'm Rosa. I am been living mostly in Montreal for the last while. I'm Latina. I've been organizing around anarchist and Black people of color in Montreal for a while. I took a break for a little bit due to mental health and have some thoughts and ideas, but nothing concrete because I just tend to have a lot of questions more than anything.
That's real. I'm curious about what your context is like, or can you give me a sense of what Montreal or what Quebec is like in that regard?
It's quite complicated. I feel like in my experience, I wasn't born in Canada. I was born abroad in Chile, in South America, and I moved here in my teens. So my experience with Canada has been mostly in Edmonton and when I visit friends out of Quebec. But it's taken me a while to figure out the sort of like racial, political context of Quebec. I think I'm still trying to understand it because the history is quite, the little that I know, the history in Quebec is very different from the rest of Canada in terms of race and how they relate to race, given that the sort of Francophone community has always felt victimized by the Anglophone community, and they both are very white. But in the past, sort of like the Francophone or sovereigntist movements have been working class and tend to have themselves as like allied a lot with like other sort of liberation movements, like third world liberation movements, and also like the Black Panther Party, which makes there's a history of connection with like race movements and race liberation movements, but currently it seems that history, in my interpretation of it, and I could be wrong, seems to just validate their experience of victimization, which makes it hard for them to be open to other races who don't fit their culture. Mm-hmm. So Quebec, from my experience, is very racist. It's very white, and feels very defensive of that. Like they don't want to acknowledge that side of themselves. Like they don't even like see it because they don't feel it's an issue because they've been a victim for so historically in their eyes through the white Anglo society. Which is quite difficult, and they feel very protective of the culture. So for them, immigrants, which a lot are people of color, and people of color don't fit their culture, the Quebec culture. So that's sort of the context, which means that in anarchist organizing, which is already in itself has been called out many times for being like very white, and especially more towards like the insurrectionary anarchist organizing that I was affiliated with. They're very white spaces, and they have a hard time solving that issue. I think people are very aware that it's a problem, but it hasn't changed since I've been in Montreal very much, which can be very difficult for people of color, and I think it's alienated a lot of anarchist people of color and black anarchists of color in Montreal, to the point that they've completely disengaged with anarchist politics. And I don't know if there's a fix to that, because a lot of it has to do with the space itself, and I don't think it has to do with the anarchist politics per se, but it's been seen by a lot of, I think, people of color and black people as it having to do with the politics. And I'm not talking about Indigenous people myself, because I haven't been organized with Indigenous folks, so I don't want to be claiming something that I'm not.
Sure.
I'm also not a black person, but I have been organizing with black people, so I have a little bit more experience with that, but I also don't want to claim their experience either, just to be clear.
For sure.
And the other thing I want to say is that in the context of Quebec, given that it has a strong history of struggle in Montreal, in the last few years with the rise of the fascists and the ultra-right, I'm not surprised that it's taken such a strong hold, given the history and given the fact that Quebec is in this mentality of victimization of themselves, and immigrants in their eyes are destroying their culture, which is super problematic. I would say it's fucked.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something I've heard from a lot of people, that Quebec is really white and Quebec is really racist, and I often, depending on who I'm hearing that from, either, not necessarily, of course, but white Anglophones kind of looking down on Quebec is oh, that place is so backwards and racist, is a different thing to me than people of color living there and being oh, I experienced the specifics of this kind of white ethnic nationalism as really intense, or I find it difficult to live here, or yeah.
The thing is, I love living in Montreal. I love the politics. I love that I get to engage with a lot of really exciting politics and actions, which compensates for how difficult it can be sometimes with the whiteness. Quite a bit, I think. However, I don't have a strong exclusionary, I engage with a lot of white folks and work with white people, and I have learned to trust a lot of white people in my organizing. But I've realized, and there's also the thing, because I've been around for so long, it's quite easy to be tokenized, and to be the one person that everybody comes to, because you're the one anarchist of color that a lot of people know. Get invited to a lot of things, get asked to do a lot of things, which has kept me in the loop when I was not doing well mentally, with the mental health. But it can sometimes feel like you're just an object for people to feel better about their own race politics. Which doesn't necessarily makes me trust them, as it's taken a long time to be able to learn to trust people. But I do want to say that this is not, Quebec is shitty, but there's so many people of color who live in Quebec, and to even when we talk about Quebec being so white and Quebec being so racist, there's a whole Montreal, there's so many people of color who live there, who live their lives, who who engage with the community, and I think it can be quite invisibilizing to do that as well.
For sure.
I've noticed it a lot in my own personal in the sort of more working class environments that I'm in, or in school environments that are not academic, sort of more technical skills.
Do you want to tell me a bit about experiences you've had of trying to have those discussions in the anarchist world, or challenge people with those questions?
I made a choice a long time ago, because I used to work for a nonprofit, and a lot of my work was to be very patient with people who are new to politics, to organizing or anarchism, or who had really bad race politics, and I spent a lot of my years being very patient with that. And so when I stopped doing that work, which was because I was burned out doing that. I decided that I was never going to teach white people about race. That it was their responsibility to figure it out and ask their own white friends, and that is a responsibility of white anarchists to teach other white anarchists about it or to talk about it within themselves. So I haven't really had a lot of moments of having to change or like talk or discuss this within anarchism. I've created spaces for anarchists of color. That's been sort of my focus. And recently, a couple years ago, I did a workshop on trying to discuss the value of like that identity politics and suppression politics are not necessarily something that we should always like dismiss in insurrection anarchism, because we need to discuss those things even if we don't agree with them politically all the time. And then mostly it's been individual discussions with friends, and that's been really hard to have close friends people you expected to be close, and then suddenly they'll say something and you're like, oh my gosh, that was really racist, or that was really shitty, and not shutting down and being like, I cannot be friends with this person anymore, but actually engaging with them and having a discussion of what it means, what they did or said. Because sometimes it's so insidious and so unnoticeable. And it's been given the decision that I made a while ago not to engage white people or teach them, it's been a bit hard to be like, especially with people I really care and I'm deeply involved in, having those difficult conversations without feeling like I'm teaching someone about something that I expect them to know. I don't know. It's a struggle. I don't have a good answer for that.
I wanted to go back to the workshop that you mentioned about identity politics and anarchism and what that looked like. I guess because we've had lots of conversations about identity politics and our frustrations with trying to relate or organize with other people of color or other queer people or whatever about
I'm nodding at what you're saying. Just
What?
I'm nodding at what you're saying.
Yeah. I guess first maybe we should talk about what is identity politics, or what do we mean when we refer to that?
Yeah. I feel it's become such a loaded term. Because even in the workshop that we're giving, I feel like a lot of people were mixing identity politics with anti-oppression politics as being the same thing. And I remember having having to like figure out what I meant by that, and then but also what everyone else meant, which is never quite. It wasn't quite the same thing.
Interesting.
I don't know if that you've had that experience.
I think so. I mean, I feel like, the right will use identity politics like disparagingly to refer in a broad way to like all anti-racist or anti-sexist struggle in some way. And that's not what I'm trying to do. But that also doesn't mean there's nothing to be critical of in ways that people organize that could be called identity politics. I think I would define it or describe it as like making a positive project out of the different identities that people have that are based on various kinds of oppression or marginalization that they experience. Like, this is a bad explanation. When I think about identity politics, I think of a particular perspective that views individuals in terms of the oppression-based identity characteristics they have: race, gender, ability, class, etc., and prioritizes organizing on the basis of those identities. To be clear, I think organizing on the basis of shared experiences of oppression is an important and valuable thing to do that holds a lot of potential for resisting capitalism, colonial power structures, white supremacy, and, really importantly, making our lives more free, both individually and with others. But I think identity politics cuts off a lot of the liberatory potential of coming together on this basis. I think it's pretty essentialist. It puts a lot of emphasis on individual and person-to-person level behaviors. It's been heavily influenced by online and social media discourse in, I think, negative ways. And it encourages a bunch of things, I think. A focus on using correct terminology, passivity, all the way up to making demands of individual people of color to follow a particular political agenda, using threats of framing you as being not a real brown person or whatever it is. and also up to making demands for representation and inclusion from the state, which I just think that's a trap. Those things exist to control us, and we don't stand to gain anything from teaching them new and nicer sounding ways to do that, or packaging ourselves up in a way that neatly fits into their logic. I don't think that will help all of us people of color and Black and Indigenous people and other people of color get free. Okay, back to the interview.
I was doing some, I don't know if it helps, I was doing some, when I did the workshop, it's 2 years ago though, so, and I haven't reviewed it in a while, but I was trying to figure out the background of it, and it seems like it's something that came from academia in the same way that queer, well, it's complicated because it started being used in academia and theorized upon in academia, and then it started spreading to like sort of academia, not like non-profit organizing. And I don't also know that this is argued because people claim that it's always been there, but I think it's a way of relating to people just based on your identity and trying just the word of intersectionality, but where that becomes the most important aspect of how you relate to someone. And the workshop I organized was specific towards insurrection and anarchists, not. So this is like a very particular, like it was trying to be very intentional about who it's directed to, because it wasn't meant for everyone. Because I think it's a different approach when trying to talk to people who don't have those share those politics. And I think within insurrection politics, it was something that has been completely like thrown out, that we should not relate to people in relation to our identities necessarily. And the point of the workshop was to remind people that the critiques are valid of identity politics in terms of how we organize and relate to each other, but I think that if we don't acknowledge that there is difference and there exists like power imbalances in how the world exists, like that's patriarchy and white supremacy and ableism, homophobia are things, and transphobia and transmisogyny are real things that affects people's mental health and well-being, but also the way that we are able to do things. And how we're able to challenge ourselves to take risks, and how we're able to challenge ourselves in terms of how, like, very personal and real effects of those powers. And not acknowledging that loses sight of the person you're organizing with, and allows for people not to challenge their own privilege, which I think is important for us to do. I think is one of the limitations of why anarchism tends to be so white in North America. But then I have a thing though. Recently, so I go to South America quite a bit and read about anarchists in South America, in Chile. This is how I am an anarchist, because those are politics that I grew up with, even if they were not called that at the time, and have been anarchists in Latin America, in Mexico, mostly in Chile, and they have a very strong anti-identity politics view. Like,
interesting.
They do not believe it's quite intense, the way that like it has created all this divisions within anarchists, because insurrection anarchists in Latin America, or in Mexico and Chile, where I'm referring to, tend to be very much like very machista, and they don't acknowledge those things, and then there's created divisions with like women and queers who've just given up on trying to change those spaces and being like, well, I guess that kind of anarchism is like masculine and machista and homophobic.
That's unfortunate, yeah. Because I feel like that was one of the things that was so exciting for me being introduced to anarchism, was that there were a lot of women and people of color and queer and trans people around. And yeah, and the way that people were doing combative projects or living their politics was not less intense because of that or something, but interesting in different ways.
And I'm making big generalizations too, right?
Sure, yeah.
There's obviously exceptions, and there's like moments that those things don't happen, and this is sort of like a general perception that I have.
I also am like sympathetic to that perspective or something of like, I don't want to be defined by the various systems in the world that oppress and dominate me, and I don't particularly want to make a positive project of that. I also don't want my relationships to be like a guilt-based calculus of like in every moment who should be giving or receiving or like accounting for things in that way, I don't know. I find it to be kind of a political dead end, because how do you get out of it if those things are so like indelibly inscribed in our bodies that when I really think about it, I don't actually think that's real. But that doesn't mean that like history didn't happen, or that like people's lives aren't really different, or that there aren't things that are indelibly inscribed in our bodies in this world. And yeah.
I mentioned earlier about having mental health stuff happen, and a lot of I had some really rough couple of years with PTSD and depression, and a lot of the causes of it have to do with the systems of power in the world. So there's like very real effects to it, where I think if it wasn't for the people I live with and my close friends who are really rad anarchists, I think I would have probably fallen through the cracks quite easily in terms of my organizing, and I would have just lost touch of what anarchism and politics were, because I was so not in a good space. And that is what makes me think of why I think it's important to remember those things, because the effects are real in people's lives. And I want to live in a world where those identities don't matter, and I do want to live in a world where like I'm not defined by the powers, the systems of power in the world. But it's hard when I can see the real effects on people's lives.
For sure.
And I can see, I've been working in the hospital system as a nurse, and also seeing the way that outside of my anarchist bubble, it is like so real in how people get treated and how they die and how they live the world, and how horrible and painful and traumatic it is every single day. That it's hard for me to balance it too sometimes, to be like, I want a world where I'm not defined by those things, but I don't think I have a choice.
Refusing to acknowledge it in your politics or relationships does not seem like a satisfying or good solution at all.
But I also don't want my friends to live on guilt. I don't want my relationships to be based on guilt. I don't want to feel tokenized because people feel they don't have enough people of color as friends, I do want to get treated as my own self, my own like person. And I feel it's a struggle sometimes, and my theoretical knowledge is not very strong, and I wish it was a little bit stronger so I can have a better understanding of how to connect these things. A lot of my politics are based on like lived experiences, I think.
Whoa, nah. Whoa, nah. Yeah. En la noche luna llena, en el día suena la sirena. Yeah. Vengo de Chile, el bajo Chile es anónimo, actores secundarios en un filme antagónico. Ese Chile es al que definen de clase media, pero tiene las medias deudas que los afligen y lo asedian. El Chile de mis iguales y los tuyos, que no salen en las páginas sociales del Mercurio. No tienen estatua y no tienen calles principales, y no son grandes personajes en las putas historias oficiales. El de montones de poblaciones que nacieron por los mismos pobladores en la toma de terreno. El de casas bajas variadas y los bloques, las casas chubi y los departamentos básicos pa' pobres. El de los almacenes y bazares varios, que quiebran cuando invade el barrio un supermercado. El de los cachureos peripersas, que resisten con fuerza al monopolio bestia del centro comercial. El de los que se van en metro pa' la Vega, parados y repletos y en metros a la casa llegan. De los que hacen su viaje en Transantiago micros y no pagan el pasaje cuando está a la mano, mijo. El Chile de los carritos de completo y sopa y pillas que siempre pillas en la esquina de un gueto, donde hay menos escuelas que botillería. El Chile de mis secuelas, de mis penas y mis alegrías.
El Chile común y corriente, ese que no salen comerciales de TV, donde los vivos se abren porque aquí son cianes. Cuidado con quemarse con este mensaje. Vengo de Chile común y corriente, ese que no salen comerciales de TV, donde los vivos se abren porque aquí son cianes. Cuidado con quemarte con este mensaje.
Vengo del Chile de Víctor Jara y la Violeta Barra, los hermanos Vergara, el Cizarro y el Zafrada. El Chile de los 33 mineros atrapados que casi murieron por culpa de negrero empresario. Ese Chile de los liceos industriales, particulares, subvencionados y municipales. El de universitarios endeudados que tienen que pagar como 2 carreras más de las que han estudiado. El Chile que realmente sufrió con el cataclismo y perdió su vivienda, su familia y sus niños queridos. Un terremoto voto no discrimina y es verdad, pero si esta forma de vida es asesina y criminal. El de los hospitales colapsados, donde no hay camillas y te atienden en las sillas o en cualquier lado. Y en invierno los pasillos están llenos de niños enfermos y un infierno es si el auge no deja abrigado. El de vendedores ambulantes, de estudiantes, deudores, trabajadores y cesantes. Frustrado el de subcontratado, portuarios, mineros, pobladores y obreros explotados. Vengo del Chile de la mayoría, que cargan en lomos el trono de unos pocos todo el puto día. El que está en la pena de mi poesía, el Chile de mis secuelas, de mis penas y mis alegrías.
Vengo de Chile común y corriente, ese que no salen comerciales de TV, donde los grifos se abren porque aquí son cianes. Cuidado con quemarse con este mensaje. Vengo de Chile común y corriente, ese que no salen comerciales de TV, donde los grifos se abren porque aquí son cianes. Cuidado con quemarte con este mensaje.
Sus discursos de unidad nacional son solo eso, discursos porque otras es la realidad. Vivimos en una sociedad segregada y no es casualidad, siempre lo quiso así la clase acomodada. Por eso cuando en Chile pienso, no te hablo de bandera, de emblemas, te hablo del Chile que vengo. Lo siento, pero si algún día grito viva Chile, será el día en que realmente Chile sea del pueblo libre. Canto de los miles y miles, desde abajo preparando los misiles. Yo. Es el poblacional. Yeah.
And that was Portavos con Stelok, El Otro Chile. You're listening to the podcast version of From Embers. You can find us at fromembers.libsyn.com. Do you want to tell me a bit about some of the recent people of color organizing that you've been doing? Or
Yeah. So I used to, before all this mental health stuff happened, I used to do anarchist people of color organizing with some groups in Montreal, and also like autonomously with a couple of friends. And it mostly involved organizing together and sort of finding common struggle together and making space for other people of anarchists and Black people of color to come together and sort of connect to anarchism. And then I stopped doing that for a couple of years because it turned into an identity. It lost the anarchist. Like, people were not interested in talking about anarchism anymore. We're more interested in talking about like identity politics and race. And that's not what I was interested in. So I stopped organizing those spaces. Mm-hmm. And then in the last year or so, I think partly as a result of working in the hospital system, it's made me want to reorganize with people of color in anarchism, with anarchist principles. And recently during the book fair in Montreal, I organized a discussion based on the rise of the right and fascism in Quebec. I split it so the beginning was sort of like an information session of what is happening in Quebec. The second part was a space for people to talk about their emotions and how it's personally affecting their lives. Also what it feels like to live in a province or a state, a place where like it's a reality that fascists and white supremacists are growing in numbers. Mm-hmm. And how it feels for people of color in Montreal. And then the last part was to organize, to find a space if we wanted to organize or do something, and like how do we relate to each other. And I was very clear that I wanted to be based on anarchist principles, like politics and ways of looking at the world, not just race. Mm-hmm. And I was quite surprised by the people that show up, and people were really stoked about it. And they were really into it. And it was a lot of people who had been stopped organizing for the last few years as well, post-strike. Mm-hmm. Who felt a bit lost in their own politics, but like felt an affinity towards anarchism, but just didn't feel included in those spaces. It was quite general, the sentiment. So we decided to keep it very low key for now. That is a very personal decision because the capacities, it's been difficult. Mm-hmm. And the idea is to just start skill sharing with each other. So learning simple things from like how to graffiti to how to be safe during demos. How to protect your identity online, why that's important, how to like discussing security culture as well, and then reading together texts that we might be interested in, that we maybe was frustrating to discuss with other white anarchists for whatever reason. So we're all bringing up the ideas to bring up different texts or ideas together and meet once a month. And then if autonomous actions come out of that, that's really exciting. But we're trying to keep it pretty low-key. That's been one of the things that I specifically with people of color that I've been trying to do.
yeah, it's interesting that people are coming back to anarchism or something, or like, yeah, finding ways to make it real in their lives that, oh, I want to like organize with people and not have to endure certain social dynamics, but yeah, still wanting to have things be possible. That's exciting.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's also cool to connect with people from the States and also Ontario on those things. I feel like that we've had you come. You've been around a lot, which is really stoked. And we have a common friend from Philly who we have a lot of conversations about this.
Mm-hmm. Did you find that in those discussions that other people were also coming up against some of the limitations of identity-based organizing, or are people like grappling with that?
I think most of the people in that room were having a really hard time with identity-based organizing. I think they had post-strike. I think a lot of people had sort of gone towards that direction. Some of them had just stopped organizing and had realized the limitations of those politics and the frustrations with it, which I didn't expect. Mm-hmm. I sort of had given up on that being a possibility. Mm-hmm. That's why it felt so exciting when I was doing that. I can't quite come with a theory around what specifically they were frustrated with, because it just happened and it felt very individual based each time. Mm-hmm. But overall there was this feeling of frustration with the amount of, I don't want to call it real change, but of the insular nature that sometimes identity politics can have. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I think so. Like, if you're really specific in the both who you want to relate to and what the shared basis for your political endeavors are, like if it's like, I want people who have a particular life background or family history or something and who also think of it a certain way, yeah, that's a particular thing. Mm-hmm. Have you found also that it's changed, or that thinking or talking through some of these things have changed the way that you organize with people who aren't people of color?
I made a decision, I think last summer, that what I was fighting for mattered more than individual people. Like individual, like I'm not going to stop organizing because someone's being racist. I'm going to either find a way to either ignore it, which honestly that's some of the things I do. I just like don't engage with that person. I'm like organizing with them, but it doesn't mean that we're close friends. And there's a certain level of trust that I have. Like I need them to like have a certain, which for the most part happens, that they don't call the cops on people, and they're not going to call immigration on someone. They're not going to like, that are for me sort of very basic. And that tends to happen with like white anarchists. They're never going to do those kind of things, you know. They're not going to rat on you, hopefully. And the more personal things I've had to encourage. Sometimes I talk to my white friends who talk about it with other people. But it feels very personal, to be honest. I have a hard time asking other people of color to do the same thing that I'm doing.
Right.
I cannot come with a general politics on it because I don't think it's fair on my part. I know I'm making a choice to engage in this kind of politics with people who might have sometimes really, it's more like obliviousness and ignorance about their own privilege and power based on being white people. And knowing that it's my choice, it makes it easier for me to engage with it in a way, to feel less of a victim of my circumstances and more of a, like, I'm an agent of what I want to be doing. Yeah. Even if in, like, practicality, we live in a world where that's very difficult to achieve.
I've found that for sure in my decisions of, like, yeah, and changing the way that I think about some of these things. A lot of it was about wanting more individual agency, or really just taking responsibility for my own actions or decisions in this way, and not having a perspective that, I don't know, made me a victim of circumstance in every situation where there were white people present or something.
Yeah. I feel also pretty lucky. I have the people that I'm really close to that are white are pretty solid and are pretty on it and insightful and thoughtful and have done a lot of work on their racism and and their whiteness and living in a white supremacist space. The people that I'm the closest to, and that I feel like having that makes it easier. I think it would be really hard if I didn't have that, for sure. I think the connections that are creating the relationships makes it easier, so I can trust them when we are actually doing things that feel more scarier. Because they're aware of what it means. Opening up to people has been really helpful in terms of like how the ways that race affects me on a day-to-day basis in a way that it doesn't. But sometimes it gets hard. Sometimes I just wish I didn't have to explain all the things or challenge all the things or question whether or not I'm being tokenized in that moment, which is why I get why sometimes people call stop organizing completely with white people.
Sure.
Like, I want to be clear that I'm not. I think that's like a choice that people make, and I'm not against people making that choice. I totally get why that happens, but that's not what I want to be doing right now. I feel like my anarchist politics feel like really important for me and how I relate to the world and the power systems. And if I didn't have that, I think it would. I need people on my side who are willing to like be combative, even if we're scared, even if I might face more oppression, or people of color who are with me might face more oppression. But I need to be able to do those things to feel like I am actually fighting a system that is destroying me every day.
I've just got to give y'all a warning for strong language. So this is Kitty Smile, Let a Bitch Know.
We all know somebody in our circles that embodies selfishness to its fullest. She has no motherfucking shame. She is cutthroat and envious from toe up, but she will never admit it though. She by your side every single day, smiling at you, but wishing, praying for your downfall. But guess what, thing? You got it all wrong, cause I figured you out from the beginning. Whatever she gets, it's never enough. Whatever she takes, whatever she wants. She wants your man, she craves your job, she dreams your life, and everything that goes with it. And everything that goes with it. Oh. It's not enough to enough. It's not enough to enough. So let a bitch know. So let a bitch know. She comes now. Let a bitch know. Say what? Let a bitch know. Let a bitch know. Let a bitch know. So let a bitch know. Say what? Let a bitch know. She comes now. Let a bitch know. Say what? Let a bitch know. So let a bitch know. Say what? Let a bitch know. She comes now. Let a bitch know. Say what? Let a bitch know. You know what? Don't get it confused, don't get me wrong. I adore ambition. I just have one single problem with vicious, jealous, backstabbing, conniving piece of shit. And you know what? It actually would be much easier. I say much easier if they would know their place. Fucking parasite. But you know what? I just gotta do it. I just gotta let him know. So let a bitch know. Say what? Let a bitch know. She comes now. Let a bitch know. Say what? Let a bitch know. So let a bitch know. Say what? Let a bitch know. She comes now. Let a bitch know.
Do you want to tell me a bit about the organizing that you and other people have been doing around demos?
Oh yeah, there's this really cool thing that's been happening. So we've been doing something called sort of post-demo care or post-demo support, which it wasn't my idea. It came from other people, but I got involved in it very early on. And the idea is that immediately after like a demo, and in Montreal demos can get very violent and confrontational, we organize sort of like post-demo care, which is the day after or like really soon after. So either the day after, or a couple of days after, we're going to a space where people can come, and there's going to be food, and we have someone who does physiotherapy, we have a nurse who does wound care, we have a therapist who does like sort of like guided meditations and trauma support. We have an osteopath, there's someone who does acupuncture, and does like acupuncture for trauma. We have someone who does tarot for people who want to get in touch with their woo magic side and deal with trauma in that way. And we've had massages. I'm trying to think what else there was last time. Herbal support. So we have a herbalist who also comes and does herbal support. And the idea is to acknowledge that if we want to do this in the long term, and we want to be able to sustain ourselves in our mental health and our mental capacities and live in a world that traumatizes us a lot, we need to be care for ourselves better and together, collectively, not just individually. And we do this. I feel like we're super lucky that in spaces I'm in, all the services are provided by friends and people we know, and they're all free. And initially it was just for like people who are involved more in confrontational tactics who would come to this stuff. And then we're trying to open it up to everyone who's coming. There's obviously security concerns about that, but we do want to make it open. And that's one of the things. And the other thing is like me and a couple of friends are doing medic care, specifically directed at the Black Bloc. So we try to stick, because there are medics at demos a lot in Montreal. Mm-hmm. And I think our goal was to it's not like we're going to deny care to someone who comes to us, but we stick close to the Black Bloc, let ourselves know that we are around. So people who do get injured or cannot go to a hospital, they can come to us. Mm-hmm. And we have enough knowledge to know when something is very serious, either because we're trained, we're like healthcare professionals, what other word is. Like we work in the healthcare system, so we know what also our limitations are in providing care and healthcare, but we can deal with a lot of things if people don't want to go to a hospital in a way that they won't feel like they have to be worried about their identities or being caught or anything like that. And I'm pretty stoked about those projects. With some of the same people that I'm doing the post-demo care and the demo medic care. Mm-hmm. We've also been trying to do some workshops on harm reduction for our community, like broader community. So on like naloxone trainings and first aid trainings. We recently organized 2-day sort of like wilderness first aid survival workshops on how to provide care for yourself when there's not access to it, like mm-hmm. healthcare for yourself when there's access to it. And that he has to do a longer training in the fall with it, and that is free, and that is so people can like sort of like also have agency on their own health, mm-hmm. but have like knowledge, not just like to know when something is very serious and know when it's not, and when you have mm-hmm. to go to a hospital, because we don't have the resources yet to be able to provide for every single health injury, mm-hmm. and to sort of like make care more communal and like to take agency over our own bodies, mm-hmm. which I'm pretty stoked about. I think it's like it's cool, and it's also acknowledges like a lot of things that sometimes that don't get addressed in our anarchist communities, which is like mental health trauma that comes from the work and the places that we put ourselves in, like mm-hmm. and trying to break that as sort of like machista, I don't know what to call it in English, but sort of this like macho culture of being like, oh yeah, we face this super intense thing, but like we're so tough, we don't have to talk about it, or like we're just going to talk about it, nothing else, when in reality, and like the people who have a hard time with it, what like doesn't get addressed as much, when in reality is like sometimes we constantly put ourselves in the line of really traumatic things, and we need to, that has effects on our bodies and our mental health in different ways for different people. But I think being able to talk about it out loud and with other people is super important. Mm-hmm. And I'm really stoked that this is happening. And I'm also really stoked about thinking in the long term of what it looks like to do health and to care for our bodies and our brains and our souls and our spirits in a way while doing this kind of work in a way that we can take agency and power, like control over. That it's not just run by the state.
Yeah, I'm also super excited about them. Like, for a lot of reasons, there's a lot of like, and I don't think this is necessarily inherent to identity politics, but I feel like I encountered it a lot in a lot of like identity-based or activist spaces, was the idea that because you experience certain kinds of marginalization in the world, the thing to do about that is take care of yourself by yourself or prioritize that over engaging in conflict or going to demos, organizing with other people, whatever that might be. And I was always less interested in that avenue.
Yeah, me too.
But it wasn't because I don't think that caring for our bodies is important or that I don't have emotions about those things or...
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like a tangible, like, practical way out of some of that kind of passivity or, like, some of that kind of, like, oh, I can't do this or I shouldn't do this or I don't have the capacity for this. It's like, maybe I wouldn't have the capacity for this by myself. But if there's, like, if I know that I can go to this aftercare thing after the demo, it really might change how I feel about that demo or what I feel prepared to do or whatever.
And I think it's important to talk about it. I feel like when I was younger, it's so much easier to like pretend that it's not there because you just want to I don't know, the rage, the anger, the frustration, or just the joy of whatever you're doing, whatever you want to call it, that thing that makes you go and do the thing, the confrontational thing. There's a point when you accepting that you're tired or that you're traumatized by it can be really difficult, I think, because it's not like you're saying that the actions are wrong that you're doing. But it felt for me when it started happening. I was feeling like I couldn't do it. Therefore, like maybe the politics were wrong. But in reality, I was like, no, we just need to find ways for us to keep doing the things that we're doing, but be better supporting each other and talking about what it feels like and the trauma that comes with it. And that's not just about like your friends asking you. It's about like a general cultural, like, or scene or whatever we want, a community, whatever we want to call that space that gets created for people who share similar tactics, is to talk about those things. And not just sort of keep it in the bedroom or keep it like with just your closest friends. And I think it's also related to like, I have done a lot of mental health support and for people who've been going through a lot of crises in the past. And that realm always felt like it was more into anti-oppression world that I would get support from. And then lately, and I was like, that's like my therapy world and my like anti-oppression world. And this is not in my anarchist world, it's different. And lately I've been really excited that these two are mixing because I'm like, I think it's really important for anarchism to have that, to be able to care and support each other in the long term. And we want this to, if we don't want us to just die in our politics to, I don't want to keep losing people because they're killing themselves. And I don't want to keep losing people because they're so burnt out they can't even like show up to anything. I want my politics to, and my confrontation to also be tied to how I love and care for those around me, and for that to be important and matter, and for us to like make space for and time for that. Because, yeah, this world is already shitty enough. We don't have to be shitty with ourselves, with each other, you know?
That's true. Were there any final thoughts you had or anything you wanted to end with?
I think just take everything I say with a grain of salt. These are my opinions, and they're a work in progress, and they're changing. And sometimes they don't make a lot of sense, and I'm trying to work on that. That's it.
Well, thanks so much for chatting with me.
Thank you for having me.
As always, we'd love to hear from you. Email us at fromembers@riseup.net. Thanks for listening.